Chapter 8 I am the Lord. For I am the Lord that healeth thee. Exodus 15:26. Times of testing came for us, where God led us through areas of deep waters and heavy storms. While none of that was fun, we would not have experienced so many beautiful miracles. The Lord showed himself so faithful to be the Lord that healeth thee. One day I noticed my youngest son was not feeling well, and one side of his face was swollen. He told me he had been accidentally struck in the face, so I just thought it was inflamed from the blow. However, as it continued to swell and his temperature began to rise, I called our registered nurse from the rest home to see him. She called the doctor and then started to give him penicillin. She even came over at midnight to give him another shot, but in the morning she could see he was not getting any better. His fever was high and going higher until he became delirious. The King's Garden Board was meeting that day, and they usually met in our front room. When they arrived, I told them of Michael's plight and asked if they could come in and pray for him before their meeting. They stood by his bedside, prayed just a simple prayer, and went on into the other room. After they left, I stood there alone, pleading with the Lord to hear our prayers, bring down the fever, and take away the delirium. As I watched, I was fascinated to see the swelling begin to recede and Michael begin to relax. I waited half an hour and then slipped the thermometer into his mouth. The fever was almost gone. After waiting another 15 minutes, my son's temperature was completely normal. Overjoyed, I rang the nurse who came right over to check on him. While she was with us, she expressed how concerned she had been, for if the infection had reached his brain, he would not have lived. She realized how ill he had been, but was afraid to let me know. Instead, she had gathered the nurses together and they had prayed for our boy. God answered all our prayers. Another time of testing was when Mike went on a business trip to the Yakima Valley. And while he was there, he began to feel so weak that he decided it was necessary to secure medical help. After an examination, the doctor told Mike that he was taking him straight away to the hospital. He was bleeding internally, and he had already lost 53% of his blood. If he did not immediately receive blood transfusions, his veins would collapse and he would die. I received a phone call telling me of his illness, and in the evening our chaplain drove me to Yakima to be with Mike. He began to respond to treatment, and after about 10 days, he was able to return home. While we were gone, the boilers for heating our buildings gave up entirely. And as it was wintertime and cold, this presented an extreme hardship on all the residents of King's Garden. It was necessary to quickly secure new boilers, which put a severe strain on our finances. The problem cast Mike on the Lord as never before, because his confinement at the hospital rendered him powerless to do anything about the situation. God used this experience to show Mike that the work was not dependent upon him alone. In fact, it was the Lord's work, and he would care for it even though Mike was ill. After we returned to Seattle, Mike was still very weak. One afternoon, he began to have a temperature, which alarmed me. I could see his heart beating in the pulse of his throat, and I knew he was getting quite ill. One of his friends came in that afternoon to visit Mike, and when he saw how sick he was, he laid his hand on Mike's head and began to pray, partly in Norwegian. I was standing by the bed and did not close my eyes, but continued to watch Mike as the prayer went on. Even as I watched, the pulse began to subside, and I knew the temperature was coming down. When the prayer ended, I slipped a thermometer into Mike's mouth, and the reading was normal once more. From that time on, Mike had periodic times of internal bleeding and was in the hospital once or twice each year. The doctors could not ascertain what was wrong, though an ulcer was suspected. Finally, Mike went to be treated by a well-known clinic in Seattle, and the verdict they gave us was that there was no ulcer, but that he had a blood vessel in his stomach which was too near the surface. And when Mike would eat something a little rough, the blood vessel would break open. This was not what we wanted to hear because there wasn't really anything these doctors could do to fix the problem. From this time on, Mike was very careful with what he ate. His health had never been robust since the time of his first heart attack, and he needed to claim the strength by faith that he needed from day to day. I longed to give him my own splendid health and strength, but of course, that was not possible. All I could do was to help him in any way I could and try to curb his tremendous ambition to accomplish all he could for the Lord. I felt he could achieve just as much if he did not drive himself to exhaustion until he would be ill again. However, his joy in serving the Lord was so great that it was hard for him to hold back. Also, I was a little afraid to say very much because I knew he had a call of God upon him, and I did not want to frustrate God's plans. So the most I felt I could do was to keep cautioning him about overworking and to urge him to take time for his naps. One boundary we were able to put in that helped Mike rest a bit from day to day was a new apartment. We had been living in the administration building since we'd arrived, and this had its disadvantages. First, everyone knew our apartment, and people would knock on the door of our apartment a great many times a day and far into the night. Even when Mike was at home, he would not get a moment's rest. Second, we ate in the dining room with all the other members of the team, and those who desired information from Mike would come and sit with us while we ate. This kept Mike from having a time of relaxation while he ate his meals. We decided that it would be necessary for us to move into another apartment and to cook our own meals. There was a small apartment that was over the school store on the grounds. Even though it was upstairs and necessitated climbing stairs several times a day, it was a great improvement over the other apartment. We lived in this place for about 7 years and enjoyed the quietness of it very much. One of Mike's endearing characteristics was his great love for people and concern to see them find the Lord. While Mike had certainly come to know God as the one who healed his body, he never lost sight of the most important healing God provided, the salvation of his soul. This reality was ever before Mike's eyes, and he wanted to share this with everyone. As he grew acquainted with men in business through the work of King's Garden, he would have a great burden to have them come to know the Lord. Not only would he pray fervently about their salvation, but he always seized every opportunity to share the gospel with them. Several of these men call him their spiritual father. One day, Dean McLean, who was then one of the county commissioners, came out to see the King's Garden. He was walking around the grounds, rather dejected, when Mike spied him and walked out to talk to him. Seeing that he was troubled, Mike asked him to come into his office. There he proceeded to testify to Mr. McLean, telling him how he found the Lord Jesus Christ and the peace and joy which this had brought him. It did not take long until Mr. McLean fell to his knees and began to pray for God's forgiveness. Then he began to sing in a beautiful tenor voice one of the old hymns. This was the start of a great friendship between these two men. I have a little devotional book he gave Mike, in which Mr. McLean has written, "I love you too, 'cause you brought me back." A few years later, Mr. McLean went to be with the Lord. This man was only one of the many who found the Lord in Mike's office. In the last few years of Mike's life, he became well known through his radio messages, and people would come to him seeking help. He was never too weary or burdened with the cares of his work to be concerned with those who needed help. There were several times when, late at night after we were asleep, someone would call on the phone asking if Mike would come to his office and pray with them. As the years went on, Mike learned that when he became too weary with the burden of the work, he needed to spend time away for a rest and would slip away for a day or two. Sometimes we would go to Garland Mineral Springs, to the ocean, or often we would just rent a motel near Seattle. These times would be periods of complete relaxation for him, and he would spend most of the time in bed, just reading and resting. We would spend part of the time praying over the various problems facing him at the moment and talking together about what was best to do. He often shared that these times of simply processing out loud the many issues weighing on him would clear his mind, and then he would know how to proceed. Then, completely rested and relaxed, we would return to the King's Garden and take up the reins once more. Once Mike experienced the benefit of getting away for rest and relaxation, he recognized the need for our workers to get away too. He began to pray for a place where, when they had time off from work, they could slip away and separate from the pressure which surrounded them at the garden. Finally, a place in Cannon Beach, Oregon was made available for lease with an option to buy. This beautiful spot was right on the ocean and very near the Cannon Beach Bible Camp. There were 11 cabins on the grounds, and also a good-sized lodge. The property was an old landmark of the early days of Oregon history, when stagecoaches used the lodge as a stopover place in their travels. We renamed it Grace Haven, and a caretaker was placed in charge of it. The cabins were rented during the summer months, and the lodge was in great demand by church groups on weekends all the year around. Though this was a wonderful place, the distance from the garden made it prohibitive for many of our workers to take advantage of the restful atmosphere. We had hoped that the rental of the cabins and the lodge would allow the garden to break even with all the finances, but that did not prove to be the case. The cost of keeping staff at Grace Haven all year round was high, and it was a continual financial drain for the King's Garden. Even though it was a Christian ministry which was very worthwhile, after a few years the decision was made to relinquish Grace Haven. We were pleased this property was taken over by another Christian group, and the ministry of Grace Haven is being continued.